and welcome to the Teaching Together podcast, where we celebrate and share the glows and grows of teacher life. I'm Sierra.
And I'm Grace.
Each episode on the podcast, we like to share a glow or grow that's been happening for us in our lives. Mine at the moment would have to be a grow because I suck at meal planning and remembering to take healthy food to school and just sort of getting caught in the trap of feeling hungry on the way home and stopping somewhere for a snack where I probably shouldn't be stopping for a snack. So a grow for me this term has been working on just being a bit more organized with that, making sure that I'm doing my groceries so that I've got healthy things to eat. And I am hoping that that has just, I guess, a bit of a better impact on my at-school energy levels because I'm, eating better and not just caffeinating my way through the day.
Oh, the struggle is real. Like everything you just said, ditto. 100% amen. Agree.
It's hard.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
What's yours?
Mine is a glow again, because I'm apparently not self-reflective enough to have a grow. But I love going to Lifeline's big book fair that they hold in Wollongong every couple of months. And 2 weekends ago, I got to go down to the most recent one. And I love it because it's held in the Illawarra Sports Stadium. So it's just literally a sports stadium full of books, which is what all sports stadiums should be used for, in my opinion.
Speak for oneself.
Yes, I say this to the person who is wearing an NRL jersey right now. But I love the big book fair. I go, I've literally been to every single one since I found out they existed. And it's just really fun to go down and just browse all these random books. And they usually have some hidden gems that I can use in my classroom. And I take my big Woolies reusable shopping bags and lug them back to my car and spend $40 on a bunch of books because they're all $2 each. It's just the best. And that honestly lifts my mood for the rest of the month. On our last episode, we talked about placement and some things you can do to prepare for placement. And we actually had a lot of fun talking about that because we just went absolutely crazy on the personal anecdotes. So if you want some top tier advice from your very intelligent teacher besties, then definitely go back and listen to our most recent episode.
If you are well past the season of having to attend placements, congratulations to you. But it might be really helpful if you flick that episode to someone you know who's finishing uni or still got a couple placements to go. I think there's lots of helpful tips in there that could be super useful for them. Today, specifically, we're looking at the Great Teaching Toolkit, which was created by Evidence-Based Education. The GTT is made up of 4 different dimensions, but today we're just looking at the last one, which is called activating hard thinking. But before we go any further, it's time for tea.
So, Sierra, what are you drinking today?
Today I am again enjoying a chamomile and spiced apple tea, which it's very refreshing and I'm enjoying it a lot at the moment, especially as we progress into these warmer days. But it is interspersed with some sparkling water from my soda stream because who drinks plain water anymore? Not me.
I do. I drink plain water.
And if you listened to our last episode, you would have been reminded about the importance of hydrating for our voices especially. And look, it is the start of a term. I always find my voice is just that little bit more stressed in the first couple of weeks of term. So I'm trying to be really diligent with having plenty of water alongside my teas and coffees. What about you?
I am actually breaking tradition here at episode 19.
Outrageous.
I know. I am just disgusted with myself. However, it's for a good cause because we record at Sierra's house and she has a real deal coffee machine that you have to froth the milk and everything. It's full on, guys, and probably very expensive. And I definitely want one.
It's actually from Aldi. So it wasn't very expensive.
Oh my gosh, my vacuum cleaner's from Aldi. It's so good. It's basically a Dyson, but from Aldi.
Aldi special buys.
Oh, so good. Anyway, and I'm drinking coffee, guys. I'm drinking coffee, but it's the most beautiful coffee ever because Sierra made a love heart with the milk. She's a latte artist and it is great. It's the best cup of coffee I've ever had, obviously. It was just fantastic. So I did buck tradition for a worthy cause. But jumping into our topic for today, thought I'd give a little bit of background in case you have never heard of evidence-based education before. I actually came across them on LinkedIn because they generate a lot of blog posts about current issues in education. And they also post these like listicles of different things to try in the classroom. Like I was reading one blog post about 5 ways to start a lesson. So like the best of both worlds, like some theory, and some current events and stuff like that. But their main project is the Great Teaching Toolkit, or the GTT, which they advertise as a highly adaptable professional development program that can be used in any educational setting. And it's based around what they call their model of great teaching, which has 4 dimensions, one of which we're looking at today. And the 4 dimensions are understanding the content, creating a supportive environment, maximizing opportunity to learn, and today's topic, activating hard thinking.
If I could just make a brief observation there.
Please.
All 4 of those dimensions fit really neatly into what we would say are our Australian professional teaching standards. Like the idea of, understand the content, know how students learn. Even though this organisation are based in the UK or in another part of the world, these dimensions fit really neatly into what we see as important for Australian education. And so there's still lots for us to learn from that.
Exactly. And we've chosen to jump right to the last dimension because we've kind of covered the other 3 in bits and pieces throughout our other episodes. And I personally find this final dimension the hardest to get a handle on in my classroom. So I thought it would be really helpful to jump in there. In the GTT evidence review, where most of the information for this episode is coming from, they even say that most learning is, quote, invisible, slow, and non-linear, unquote. So how are we even supposed to know if it's happening? Since you've got a few more years' experience in the classroom than I do, Sarah, I thought I'd ask you before we really get into the meat of this discussion, how do you monitor your students' learning? And I understand it's a bit of a loaded question, and we're actually going to spend the whole episode kind of talking about that. But how do you design tasks that, activate hard thinking, and how do you determine whether that hard thinking is actually happening?
Ugh, definitely a loaded question. And there's just so many different ways that I'm monitoring to see whether and how learning is happening in my classroom. I think, my subject is just one that sort of just seems to sit slightly outside most of the others in terms of, format, and a lot of the theoretical side of my subject is really delivered alongside very, very practical hands-on tasks. So I think the first thing I would have to say is actually that it's really hard. Like it's actually really challenging to, monitor students' learning. I think in my subject, it's just not that same sort of amount of like data collection all the time and really easy to document tasks, if that makes sense. And there's definitely still data, and I know that data comes in all sorts of forms and shapes and sizes, but honestly, a lot of the way that I'm monitoring my students' learning is simply just monitoring their behaviors in the classroom. And I mean behavior in the sense of like, how are they approaching the tasks that are set before them? Are they engaging in problem solving and design thinking kinds of behaviors, or are they just wanting someone to give them the answer? Because I'm really looking for that sort of creative thinking in my classroom. That's where a lot of the learning happens, in that more creative approach, as opposed to someone just give me the formula and tell me what the answer is, kind of thing. So I'm monitoring behavior and really engaging with students who verbally, trying to elicit from them what their thoughts are on how they might tackle a certain challenge that they're facing. And yes, they have written assessment tasks, obviously, that, involve marking, and I, can track sort of their progress through the year in those. And I think in some senses, the style of assessment that we do in my subject is quite consistent throughout the year and throughout the grade levels, which is really beneficial in some senses because it does allow for really, really clear building on learning. And so, it's easy for me to, I guess, compare what a student did in their design portfolio last year versus what they've done this year, or last term versus this term, because the actual style of task is quite similar. So it is easier, I guess, to see how they're growing, as opposed to we're looking at totally different topics, and like one assessment task was a research case study and the other was a diorama, and it's really hard to see how their learning is sort of maybe growing along a continuum there, whereas my subject really allows for that. So that is one thing that really helps. But yeah, I like to remember that an assessment task is often not the whole picture. It's usually just a blip at one point in one place in time. And, it's rarely the full, the full picture of what the student knows and is able to do. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not learning. They just might not have demonstrated it in that task at that time. So yeah, there's so many different factors to consider when you're basing a child's learning off purely an assessment task. Just, I guess, lots of questioning too, and trying to ask open-ended questions and not ask leading questions. And yeah, there's a lot of research on how to ask good questions, and recommendations for things like, if the one thing that you plan for your lesson is the questions that you ask, then, let it be that. There's so often sort of the questions that we just try to whip out off the top of our head, oh, does everyone get that? Or those kinds of questions are not actually going to give us the feedback that we hope for from those kinds of questions. So, trying to be really thoughtful about the type of questions I use so that I can assess whether my students have understood the concept or whether they're engaging in that problem-solving type of thinking, is probably the main things I can think of that I do, but it is just not always very black and white.
Oh, 100%. And actually, questioning is one of the main things we're going to be talking about later on, which is fantastic. And I have noticed in doing research for this episode that a lot of the advice and research in this area of the Great Teaching Toolkit is stuff that I've already encountered in my first year of teaching as just good practice. So hopefully we're not blowing any minds here, but hopefully we're also, empowering you with some good pedagogy to go and be even better a teacher than you already are. But there was something that I just wanted to preface before we get really into the discussion. I know I've already said that, but even before we get into the discussion, one last time, just bear with me. I read that quote before about how most learning is invisible. And I actually wanted to rebut this because our wonderful friend of the show, Ron Richart, who two of my colleagues got to meet last term, and I was so jealous, his whole jam is making learning visible. And that is literally the name of a book written by the people at Richart's Project Zero. It's literally a book called Making Learning Visible. And he has his thinking routines toolbox, which we love at Teaching Together. And we will chuck a link to that in our show notes so you can check it out if you haven't already. We've done a whole episode on thinking routines. We love them, and they are a great way to make learning visible. So I would argue that learning can be invisible, but it's actually pretty easy to make it visible if you have the right tools. So I just wanted to preface that. But it is slow, and it is definitely non-linear. And just like Sierra said, it can be really complicated to try and draw out of students an understanding of what they know, because you're basically trying to read their minds. And because they're students, they're at a stage of their life where they're trying to understand how to properly communicate and articulate themselves, and they might not have the language to express their thinking. And those are all tools that you need to equip them with as your teacher, as their teacher. But we're going to get into that. So we're going to kick off with just a very quick summary of the model of great teaching.
Well, like Grace has already said, this model has 4 dimensions, and each dimension has a number of elements. We're looking at the 4th dimension, activating hard thinking, which has 6 elements. And these are structuring, explaining, questioning, interacting, embedding, and activating. So we're going to spend this episode summarizing each of these elements and give you some practical examples of what each of these might look like in the classroom.
So the first one is structuring, which may sound fairly self-explanatory, but according to the GTT Evidence Review, structuring refers to the choice, matching and sequencing of learning tasks and signaling how they contribute to learning goals. So essentially, the GTT acknowledges that displaying like your learning intentions or aims or objectives to students at the beginning of the lesson, like we are learning to or something like that, is one way to do this. But this review didn't sound like it was a huge fan of that kind of explicit approach. But they do acknowledge basically students need to know what they're going to learn, and more importantly, why they're learning whatever it is they're learning at this point in time. So the sequencing part of structuring is quite important in this framework. So you need to, at some point, justify with your students why it is that at this point in the unit, rather than at the end or the beginning or somewhere next term, you're learning about Napoleon or whatever.
It is actually also, if we go back to looking at like cognitive psychology and what we know of, I mean, there's loads of different theories, and there's also a wide range of differing opinions on the, I guess, how much we rely on those kind of sciences and theories when it comes to learning in the classroom. But things like learning intentions and making sure that students understand why they're learning, what they're learning. If you think about the structure of long-term memory and things like that, it's also really critical if you're going to make it easier for students to encode or be able to sort of put into long-term memory the things that they're learning in that lesson. You have to be able to help them make connections to what they already know. So, you know, when you're saying why they're learning it now is really important for them to understand. When you are articulating that to them, you should actually be explicitly making the link to what they already know, that they can link this new piece of information to, or this new idea in the lesson to, because that's going to be much easier for them to then, I guess, file that information away in the correct place, quote unquote, in their mind, because they've actually got something that they can, I'm learning about, what did you say? Napoleon.
Yeah.
I know nothing about Napoleon, so I can't continue that example. But, I'm learning about photosynthesis now because I already understand the structure of a plant.
Yeah.
And because I understand the structure of a plant or the structure of a cell or whatever it is, I can now link this process to what I know about that. And now all of it makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this toolkit refers to that kind of structure as a schema, where
that's what it's called,
where
schema.
all of your learning is connected and all makes sense, and there's a reason for everything, and makes it easier to remember. And also just makes it more interesting as well. And this kind of approach means that you need to be really intentional when you're programming. I'm learning this as we're programming this year at my school. We sometimes think, actually, I think what we programmed to be after this inquiry question, this other inquiry question would actually be better before it, because it's all building blocks, kind of, because in our inquiry-based, concept-based curriculum, we're building towards a generalization, which is something else that the structuring element is kind of focused on, rather than just being able to recite, all the significant battles of World War I or whatever. you're coming to a generalization about the nature of global conflicts in general. And the First World War would be one example of that. And so, you use examples as building blocks to get to something that's more transferable, which means that everything needs to be sequenced and structured in a way that makes sense.
And where possible, like ideally you'd really want that sequence to be continuing across the year levels. Like not just, well, I'm the kindergarten teacher, so I'm programming and sequencing for my class here and now, which you are, but and you probably do this because your whole stage and everything is quite collaborative, but to know like when for the teachers who are on year one to know what your students have already done, like you really want those building blocks to continue right the way through. And that's something that I think I mentioned on the last episode that I'm going to be doing some reprogramming for next year, particularly for my stage 4 classes because we've got a new syllabus coming out. But I really, really want to take that opportunity to sort of do some backwards mapping, like because it often feels like there aren't those clear building blocks from one year level to the next or from one stage to the next.
Yeah, this was about report writing, but we actually got all of our junior school teachers together last term and got a bunch of work samples together and put them in a line from pre-K all the way up to stage 2, and then had a look at the standard of work and what we could expect at the end of kindergarten in reference to the beginning of year 1. And so we and also like the end of pre-K versus the beginning of kindergarten. So we kind of knew where we were kind of aiming with our students by the end of the year, which was just really helpful. And yeah, having that holistic approach just makes more sense.
It does. Dimension 2 refers to explaining, and we're pretty familiar with how to explain things in our line of work. But the evidence review suggests that the best presentations are concise and appropriate, and they are engaging explanations that are just right for the students, not too short, not too long, not too complex, not too simple. And that's a lot to juggle. There's a lot of factors in there when we are trying to make effective and useful explanations for our students. We're also really urged to consider the cognitive load that our explanations, put on students. Very briefly, cognitive load theory, that's a whole episode in itself, but was first proposed by Sweller in the 1980s and suggests that there's a limit to how much new information the human brain can process at one time, depending on the type and complexity of this information. So bearing that in mind, the Great Teaching Toolkit suggests that teachers should ensure that they break large or complex ideas down into smaller, more digestible parts and make links to existing knowledge wherever possible, like we talked about earlier, and essentially craft every explanation to be as efficient and effective as possible, which honestly sounds exhausting and time-consuming.
Yes,
and for people like ourselves who can quite easily ramble on, certainly on appropriate matters and things that might be useful and relevant somewhere along the line.
Don't know what you're talking.
Learning to be concise and to break information down. I don't know why I wasn't taught this at university as part of being a teacher, but when I started my master's, we did my whole first subject was about a whole bunch of different theories to do with cognition and whatever. And we learned a lot about working memory and just about the structures that are involved in working memory and short-term memory and long-term memory and all the different moving parts. And I was reading an article earlier this week about how, so originally the working memory, number has been for a long time that you can only hold about 7 pieces of information in your brain, plus minus 2, depending on your age and cognitive ability and things like that. But this article I was reading says that in actual fact, it's probably more like 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Because say if you asked to remember a phone number or something like that, 8 numbers, they're all numbers. So it's easier for you to remember that 7 plus 2 kind of, you've got 7 items in your head, 7 numbers in your head or 8 numbers, whatever. But when we're trying to hold very different pieces of information in our working memory, our capacity to hold 7 plus 2 actually reduces to it's more like 3 or 4. So cognitive load and working memory do often go hand in hand. And one of the things I remember learning about was just like how, every time someone walks past the window in your classroom, or there's, like a sound or something to look at, like each of those things take up space when you're trying to explain things. And so really chunking or breaking things down is such a simple approach, but you do need to, it's such a simple strategy to help like make information and explanations more digestible for students. But I think it also helps us with things like our time management even, and just making sure that we're not sort of going on and on in detailed explanations that might have gone beyond what's necessary or without checking for understanding before we continue. So when you identify the chunks of information, or, what is this concept that I want my students to understand, and you identify sections or ways that you can break that down, it really, I think, strengthens your explanation. But to do that on the fly can be really hard.
And I just wanted to jump in and say that in my school's inquiry-based model, we actually don't really do a lot of explaining. This phase or element is more student-directed, and I will give my students an activity that they need to do that's kind of like a provocation, and they just kind of have to explore, and then we come back and talk about it. So, yeah, what explaining looks like will be different depending on, what kind of pedagogy or school follows. But I mean, sometimes I do need to explicitly teach things because my kids are 6, and there is always a place for a blend of different teaching styles. And you need to know your audience as well. And this definitely gets easier the longer you spend with your students. But especially when I'm dealing with kids who don't have a very long attention span and can't sit still for very long, I need to be really succinct and kind of figure out what's the one thing I need my kids to know today.
Yeah.
Because that's basically all they can handle.
Yeah. Because even when they do come back to you after, say, their more exploratory learning, there's still like connections that you're trying to help them make that would involve explaining. And really those connections, like activating prior knowledge or helping them to link ideas together, is like a key way that we have effective explanations anyway. So whether it's, whether it's through explicit teaching or something a bit more exploratory, it's always about connecting new ideas to existing ideas. The GTT also suggests that the final element of high quality explanation is a collection of good examples, also non-examples and borderline cases. I love this, one of my favorite books. We've posted about it on Instagram before. It's called Understanding How We Learn. And it's actually such a good book because it's really visual, it's really short, it's really succinct, it provides a great explanation. And it goes through 6 strategies that have been, I guess, tested over time and have proven to be the most beneficial learning approaches from like a psychological perspective. They're not really pedagogies, they're more like strategies. But one of them is literally giving examples. Like that's one of the most tested and effective strategies in the psychological context to say that's essential for learning. So that includes, it includes quality worked examples. It includes non-examples. Here's what it is. Here's what it's not. And I love this borderline cases suggestion too. Did you know in the HSC, that's how they often how they help define bands? They get like something that they think is a borderline between a band 5 and a band 6, and then the judges all sort of use those borderline cases to help like make a definitive, this is a band 6, this is a band 5. So yeah, even doing that kind of approach in your own classes is really, really helpful for strengthening the quality of your explanations. So one practical way that you can integrate this into your classroom, I guess, in addition to making sure that you're thinking about what are the key points of my explanation, how can I chunk this and break this down for my students? You can also provide them activities following maybe your explanation or as part of the lesson where you actually give them a partial solution or a problem that has an incorrect answer that they need to fix. That's one way that we can really engage students in sort of deeper thinking about something, and also where they have to almost provide an explanation for why it's wrong, and they're practicing that explaining and identifying what's an example of the thing that you're learning and what's not an example of the thing that you're learning.
And we do this a lot in kindergarten, and we do lots of picture sorts because we can't write or read yet. And basically we're sorting what is an example of a connection, for example, and what is not. And then we put it up on our anchor chart and that stays on the wall for the term. Like, it's pretty basic, but it's really helpful. And the third element is questioning, which I said we would come to. And it is highly unlikely that this is new information to anyone listening to this podcast, but the types of questions teachers ask are capable of eliciting different types of thinking from students. Who would have thought? And the GTT proposes two purposes for teacher questioning. The first is to promote student thinking, and the second is to assess it, which is what Sierra was talking about at the beginning of this episode. So in this case, it really is a case of quality over quantity. You really need to think about the questions you're asking. And like Sierra said before, if you're going to plan one thing for your lessons, it should probably be what kind of questions you're asking, because that's how you're going to engage your students and how you're going to figure out what they know and how they're learning. So when we're using questioning to promote student thinking, this can take a lot of forms, and it doesn't just have to be you're sitting or standing up the front and asking your students questions verbally, even though it can. Sometimes it looks like me reading a storybook and asking my students, how do you think this character was feeling? They tell you, and then I say, what makes you think that? And that's promoting thinking. And that's appropriate to their developmental level because they're 6. And what makes you say that is actually sometimes really hard for them to figure out, because they're like, well, it's obvious, isn't it? And you're like, well, yes, but you as the 6-year-old have kind of jumped a step. I need you to be able to articulate what's going on in your brain. I need you to tell me what you're thinking, even though that kind of is just, sometimes it's a little bit too much for them, but some of my kiddos can really get it. And it's really interesting to hear some of their actually quite insightful responses to that question, what makes you say that? And like I just said before, we do lots of picture sorts in kindergarten with examples and non-examples and stuff. But we've also done an activity where I gave students pictures of different animals and said, sort these into groups, however you like. I'm not telling you what groups they need to be, just kind of do it. And that is a type of questioning. I'm giving them a task. And then it's promoting student thinking, because I would then, once we come back to the whole group, I would ask students to justify and explain their decisions to the class. So I had some students say, well, all of these animals live in water, so they're all together. Or all of these animals are dangerous, so they live together. Or all of these animals have feathers, so they live together. And I can tell you that none of the students organized those animals the way that I thought they would. Absolutely none of them. So it's really interesting to see how a 6-year-old views things versus a 26-year-old. And that's what I really like about inquiry-based learning too, is that kids can kind of come up with stuff. And then we move on to questioning for assessment. And this can also be pretty varied as well, but maybe a little bit more finely targeted, because you are basically trying to read a student's mind or kind of interrogate them into revealing what they've learned. And so, I mean, we do lots of informal assessment in kindergarten in terms of I'll get my kiddos to regularly write their numbers and letters on whiteboards. And we do this at least once a week, at the very bare minimum once a week, usually more often, because they're developing so quickly in this area that it's really helpful just to go, okay, write me your letters or write me your numbers 1 to 20. And that's a form of questioning. And also kind of giving them a word to sound out and saying, what's this word, or whatever, or asking them, how could you split the number 6 into 2 equal groups, and get them to do that. So it's pretty basic. It's asking them a question about something that's already been taught, basically. And I just wanted to highlight this really interesting quote that I got from this evidence review. What has been learnt is not the same as what has been taught. And I was like, well, that's a bit harsh. But in some cases, yeah, if you're not being super mindful about how you're presenting things, you could be operating with students that have a complete misconception or misunderstanding of what you've taught them, or they've been practicing something the wrong way this whole time, and you don't realize because you haven't been questioning them throughout the unit. You just do a test right at the end and you realize, oh, whoops, I taught that incorrectly, or they misunderstood me, or whatever. And so questioning in terms of promoting student thinking and for assessment is really, it's feedback for you on your teaching and their learning, and thinking, what do I have to change to better, communicate what I want my students to learn, and stuff like that. And we cannot move on from this element without mentioning, again, the Project Zero Thinking Routines Toolkit, because a thinking routine is a great form of questioning, both for promoting student thinking and for assessment. And I love thinking routines because they do create a tangible example of student responses, ideas, questions, misunderstandings, etc., that can be referred to later on. And they also require students to articulate their thoughts in a way that others can understand. So they really need to get into that phase of metacognition, and like they're answering a prompt for whatever thinking routine it is that you've chosen, and they need to be able to respond to that in a way that makes their thinking accessible to others. So seriously, we love thinking routines so much. They are fantastic. You can use them with all ages, in all groups, with all in all subjects, and they are really a great form of questioning. I think basically questioning, I had a narrow definition of questioning as asking a question, but I think in this context, it's more creating a prompt that students have to respond to, or some kind of learning task, I think is probably a more accurate definition of that term in this context.
Yeah. Have you seen that phrase, like task, don't ask?
Yes.
Yeah, that was really coming to my mind when you were talking about like the animal sorts and things like that. Like, it's not just asking them a question and they sort of say, I don't know, or they give you an answer and they're done with their thinking. But actually by giving them a task, like if you had have just said, what's the same about these 2 animals? And maybe they said, they've all got 4 legs. And it's true, they're playing spot the difference or whatever. But by you doing that activity where you've given them a task, and then they have to justify their decisions around that task, you certainly seem to get much more out of the learning process there than by simply asking them, what's one thing that's the same with these animals. Like, yeah, there's a lot of different ideas and strategies that people have around, tasking rather than just asking. And I think particularly as you move into the higher years, where often just a cop-out response will just be, oh, I don't know. And there's always a challenge between, wanting to push students because you don't want them to just have a lazy I don't know, but also wanting to be sensitive because if they don't know and you have asked that question in front of the whole class, maybe they're feeling really stressed about that. So by tasking rather than just point blank asking, there's still space for that. But by redirecting some of your questions into tasks that you can then, move around and engage with and see how different people have responded to that task, it probably is going to give you so much more feedback than just asking a question and having one person answer it.
Yeah, and the whole purpose of this is activating hard thinking, and you're not doing a lot of hard thinking if you're stressing, because you're like, what if she picks me and I don't know the answer to this question? And that's not learning, that's just performing. And we don't want any stress.
No. The 4th dimension is called interacting. And in this instance, the GTT defines interacting as the quality of learning interactions between teachers and students, which is central to the learning process. These are often seen as a form of feedback, and there's, again, two distinct purposes here. Feedback both to teachers that informs their decisions, super important, and feedback to students that helps them actually learn. Feedback to teachers is much the same as questioning for the purpose of assessment, so we'll just jump right to feedback to students. The important thing to remember here is that good teachers adjust their practice based on the feedback they receive, whether this is coming from colleagues or supervisors or students or wherever. Early in my teaching career, I was recommended a book called Explicit Direct Instruction, which I think was a really valuable read, even though I don't necessarily follow that sort of very formulaic explicit instruction approach every single moment of every single day. But to have an understanding of here's a sort of formula for explicit instruction as a new teacher, I found really helpful. Like, oh, this is kind of a process I can follow if I come across something that really needs to be explicitly taught. And anyway, as part of reading that, checking for understanding forms one phase of the explicit sort of teaching model. And one of the recommendations was that when you are doing a check for understanding, whether that's through using like little whiteboards or through, an online quiz or just, a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of survey of the room, when you're doing those kind of checks for understanding, if you have less than 80% of your students, correctly responding to whatever you've just taught them, then you need to reteach. And so I don't really know 100% where this 80% figure comes from. And ideally, you want all of your students to understand what you've explained to them before you move on. But I think it is a helpful gauge, and I've found it really helpful, especially when I use tools like Quizzes. It gives you a class accuracy percentage at the top of the quiz. And so if I can see that my class has done a quiz on this thing that we've just learnt and, they only got 50% accuracy, and I've questioned for assessment, the questions I've put in there are to gauge whether they've sort of understood the concept, and we're only hitting 50-60% accuracy, well, then that's feedback to me to say, hey, we're probably not ready to move on from this because such a large portion of the class has a misunderstanding or a misconception, or just hasn't been able to link that to prior knowledge to sort of make enough sense of it.
Yeah.
So I find that 80% figure helpful as a bit of a guide sometimes when, even if you're doing whiteboards, like a quick scan of, that you've got 20 kids in your class or 30 kids in your class or whatever your number is.
Yeah.
And if you know what your like incorrect number rate is in your mind, to sort of go, if I have any less than, 5 wrong, then I've got to sort of rehash that. I think that's really helpful. Again, it's not a perfect formula, but to have that kind of procedure that came from that book as a new teacher, I found really, really helpful. We have just done a whole episode on feedback and the importance of feedback and some ways that you can finesse your feedback, if you will.
Sierra is the queen of temporary mark withholding. This is her jam.
Okay, I really love feedback. Over the last 2 to 3 years, I've really worked hard to sort of build my approach to feedback, build a culture of feedback in my classes. And this is something that is still growing and a bit flexible, but I have really come to a firm belief in the fact that feedback is separate to grades and marks, and that my students will get so much more out of their feedback when I engage them in that. And I have a variety of different strategies that I use to get them involved in the feedback rather than me. I said this a few episodes ago and I'll say it again, but feedback for students should be more effort for them than it is for you.
Amen.
So, when I was once upon a time writing long written comments that, uni tries to tell you that, your comments need to be like actionable and, really useful for students in that way. And I was trying so hard to do that. And then students just were not engaging in the feedback because they would just read their mark and they'd move away from it. And I was actually reading a little bit more into that this week. And there was a study done at a university somewhere where, students, how when you get your uni assessments back through like the online portal kind of thing, you can just sort of access your marks and access your feedback. And they were doing this survey in a university to see how many students just look at the mark and didn't download the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them, like if they can access their mark without accessing their feedback, most of them just did.
Yeah.
So it's just huge how our students do the same thing. They are interested to know in how they performed and generally less invested in, well, what can I do better or how do I make this part of my learning? So there's a few different things that I do to engage students in their feedback before they receive their marks. So that's the idea of temporary mark withholding. So I'm still going to give them their marks. They can still access their marks if they want to, although some of them I've observed are becoming less fussed about that once they have gone through this process a couple of times. Obviously, they still get grades on their reports and things like that. So I have an obligation to make sure that they can get their marks back if they want. But I don't give them access to that until they've engaged in their feedback. One thing that I will do sometimes is I'll give them a little reflection sheet that has some of the assessment criteria on it with then 2 columns. One column says, how did I go? And the other column says, how will I grow? And the students actually have to self-identify, like, how did I go in relation to this criteria? How will I grow in relation to this criteria? They might fill that in based on the feedback that I've given them. They might fill it in because they've self-marked first. So I might ask them to self-mark. I might ask them to peer mark, especially if they're the type of class that doesn't like to be judgmental of their own work. It's easier for them to, I guess, assess their friend against a criteria than it is to assess them.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of self-marking or peer marking happens before we give feedback. Then they give themselves some feedback. They get some feedback from me. That feedback from me might be verbal. It might be written. I might have done a little voice memo that I've shared with them. It might actually be me standing up the front of the classroom saying, hey, everyone, as a class, these were our strengths. These were our weaknesses. Here's some tips on how you could grow in these areas. And then when they actually go and do their self-marking, they've already got some actionable steps from that they could implement for themselves when they sort of feel in that how did I go, how will I grow framework. There's a few different ways that I get them to engage in their feedback, but ultimately I make sure that they have something to do with it first, and that it's not just hours and hours of me writing something that they ignore to just find out what their percentage is.
Because I'm one of those uni students who looks at my mark because I was so stressed about receiving the feedback that I would feel sick.
But sometimes we do that because we know that we're not going to do anything ever like that again.
Literally.
Right? So that also comes down to course design, assessment design, like what you're actually saying you're assessing your students on. How important is it to assess them on one particular fact that happens in one time and place, as opposed to skills and broad? I mean, I know, yes, just bear with me, but I know that there's facts and things that our students need to know, but also there's so much more.
Yes.
And
what you consider a fact now might actually change in the future.
Yes.
Like facts actually are changeable, which is why, and I know I say this all the time, but I'm loving inquiry-based instruction because it's about those transferable and timeless
Yes.
concepts and skills that make you a better human. Let's be real.
And we live in like an information age. Like
Yes.
if they don't know what years particular wars occurred in, they will be able to find that out in about 30 seconds. Choosing what we're assessing on, what we're giving feedback on, as opposed to just, you were right, you were wrong. I think there's so much more we can be doing in that space than what I received as a student and what I'm sure you received as a student as well, Grace.
Yeah, totally agree. This was a shared soapbox. I'm right there with you.
All right, we must keep moving on.
We must. Element number 5 is embedding, which is quote unquote getting the learning to stick. So this element comes directly from cognitive load theory and the idea that, quote, memory is not just a storage facility for facts that could just as easily be looked up. Wow, I think someone really intelligent said something really similar not that long ago. But the schemas that we use to organize knowledge in memory are the very things we use to think with and to connect new learning to. Can you see why we did this episode, guys? We love this. A very basic way to embed learning is to just practice it a lot. It's basically becoming fluent in the learning.
That's retrieval practice.
Yeah, there we go.
It's practicing retrieving the thing that you want to know. You can recite your phone number without thinking about it now because you had to work really hard to recall it the first few times you were asked for it. And yeah, that's why it's literally one of the most effective embedding techniques or encoding techniques. I love inside out. So, the more that you walk the path to take that memory off the shelf, the easier it is to find your way back to that spot on the shelf next time.
Yeah.
Or the other way I've heard it explained is like if you go on a bushwalk and there's not necessarily a path there, but you know where to walk because you can see where the people have walked before. And the more that people walk along that path, the easier it is to follow and the clearer it is. Like that's how retrieval works, kind of making pathways in our brain.
I love that analogy. That's so good. I can see it in my brain. So in my classroom, we do daily 10-minute maths reviews that address everything we've covered this year. Not all at once, like we spread out the reviews over the whole week. So across the week, they're reviewing everything we've learned so far because kiddos learn a lot in kindergarten. Like literally every day they're learning something huge and new and exciting for the very first time. So it's really important that we embed or encode those foundational skills that they'll need for the rest of their lives. So we practice those a lot until they become automatic, like reciting my phone number. We also practice reading every day, obviously. So the skill of sounding out a word and then putting those sounds together to read the word is embedded in my students by the end of kindergarten. Fingers crossed for some of them. It's looking a bit dicey, but overall, and that's just something that hopefully, most of us, we kind of just do without thinking. And that's kind of the idea, especially with these foundational skills in kindergarten. There are some other strategies that the GTT recommends. And Sarah is smiling because I'm thinking she is loving what they recommended. So some quality research has gone into this framework. But
Absolutely.
Interleaving, which is I literally hadn't heard about it until this.
It's so fantastic.
But you basically review or practice several different topics or skills at the same time, which is basically what we're doing with maths reviews. I mean, even though it's all maths, it's different types of maths. So it's not just looking at addition on Monday and multiplication on Tuesday and 3D objects on Wednesday. We look at a little bit of each on every day. And yes, Sienna, yes,
Sorry,
you have something to say.
I've got my hand up. Okay, interleaving is another one of the same strategies from my favorite book, Understanding How We Learn. So highly reviewed, highly researched, highly effective. So I often use maths as an example for where this can be used well. Because, high school maths chapter reviews, you're doing 20 questions of the same thing, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I'm doing the same thing. I'm practicing the same process over and over and over again. So interleaving is obviously the idea of shaking it up, but it's most effective when you use similar enough concepts that could lead to misunderstanding. So yes, you might do addition, subtraction, and multiplication in kindergarten, say, because they're all close enough that they might forget like which way around that goes.
Yes.
But I'm not dissing your maths reviews sheets at all. But if we're saying really interleaving, like we wouldn't be doing addition, shapes, and patterns.
Yeah.
Or maybe you do shapes and patterns, but you wouldn't do like you're trying to find things that are close enough together that could have some sort of misconception, and you want students to be able to differentiate between those things correctly.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And they're not so far apart like, oh, I'm interleaving because I'm practicing maths and reading at the same time.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much for that. I do have a question though. Why is it called interleaving and not interweaving?
Well, like interleaved pages, like that's a thing, isn't it? Like, you know, when you like, I'm doing hand signals that isn't really explaining it at all.
No,
Like when you put one page,
sense.
if you were interleaving two books together,
because
you'd put one page down and
thing of a book. Yep, I was not there. As a book lover, I'm ashamed of myself.
I really thought that you'd pick up on that one.
Wow.
Weaving, you've gone the crafty way and I've gone the literary way when really we're the other way around.
Wow, I hate myself right now. Moving on. Another suggested strategy is varying the conditions of practice, which basically is getting students to practice similar knowledge in different ways, which you could say is like addressing different learning styles. Like, you know, you read something and then you listen to it and then you write it down and then you kick a ball and respond your timetable or something. I don't know. And we do this a lot in kindergarten, again, because we're practicing very foundational skills, especially in number sense, particularly when I'm introducing students to the numbers 1 to 10, and I'll get them to write it down, and then I'll get them to like build their number out of Lego, and then I'll get them to represent the number using counters, and then I'll get them to draw a picture of their number, and then I'll get them to divide it into groups or whatever. Practicing it a lot of different ways in different contexts. Because when you transfer contexts, that can indicate whether you've just learned something by rote or whether you actually understand it.
Correct. And you mentioned learning styles, which we all know is a little bit of a dicey topic. But what I think is really critical about exactly what you're saying you're doing is that you're not saying, well, this child's a visual learner, so they're going to make it out of Lego or they're going to draw it. And this child's, you know, a kinesthetic learner, so they're going to go and do one push-up and that's the number one. Like, you know, it's not about pigeonholing students, but actually multiple exposures to the same content in different contexts, exactly like you're saying. Even if we're drawing on learning styles as simply a guide for different ways we can learn the same thing, not saying, I'm a visual learner, so I can only learn it this way.
And it's just more interesting also, like for the teacher and the student. Bonus.
Absolutely. And we have reached the 6th dimension of activating hard thinking, which is literally called activating.
What a surprise.
And it's helping students to become independent by planning, regulating, and monitoring their own learning. The focus of this element is metacognition, the big fancy word for thinking about your thinking, with the ultimate goal of being able to encourage students to become independent and self-actualized learners. At this stage, students are being supported to take responsibility for their own learning and exercise a degree of autonomy in the classroom. We again refer to one of our favourites, Ron Richart, whose thinking routines are a super helpful way that students can structure and explain their thinking in any context. Now we're at the stage of the process where students need to become more independent, and thinking routines can provide them a scaffold to start with so they aren't beginning with a blank page. Project Zero literally calls it a toolkit because they are easily accessible resources or tools that students can use. They should be familiar with them if you've been using them in your classroom already. And then they can take them independently to help organize and communicate their thinking to themselves and to others. We also have an episode from earlier this year looking at self-regulated learning, and that might also be a really helpful listen for you if you haven't heard that one yet, where we speak with Dr. Cheyenne Barr, who specializes in metacognition and self-regulated learners. We've walked through structuring our lessons, and we've thought about our questions and how we're going to explain things, and we've given students feedback, and now we want them to actually take that and go and know what to do with it themselves. And that's not an easy transition for a lot of our students. So when we're thinking about activating, we really want to try and put the bumper rails of the bowling alley up to help our students become more independent in how they regulate and monitor their learning. And even in our feedback episode, we talked about encouraging students to ask for feedback on particular things. That could be one feedback strategy that you use. So rather than, writing huge feedback comments, after the students do some self-reflection, they might ask you for feedback on one area that they really felt like they struggled with. And so that to me is thinking about that whole idea of getting students to regulate and monitor their own learning. You're putting the scaffolds and the structures in your classrooms to support them with that, but you're trying to hand over some of the responsibility to them so that they're actually thinking deeply and engaging in the learning that's happening in the classroom.
I'm just in awe of my podcasting partner, everyone. So we have at last reached the end of this mammoth episode, and my brain is actually tired from all the talking. So if your brain is tired, thank you for making it to the end. We are on all the socials. We are on all your podcast streaming platforms of choice, where we love your 5-star reviews. If you want to review us any less, don't. And please continue to listen to all our episodes. We love you very much.